So I think what actually happened was germ theory possibly was invented as a scapegoat to draw the attention away from the true cause, to say, look, it's not the plastic, it's not the poison, it's not the unsanitary living conditions, it's not the processed food, it's not the smog in the air from manufacturing facilities, it's not the synthetic clothing that you're wearing, it's not the poison that we're putting in the water supply, it's not the artificial lighting that you're being exposed to, it's not any of these things. It's the germ. So focus on nature. It's nothing that man is doing, it's what nature is doing.
Okay, everyone, welcome to another show, and I'm really happy to have this gentleman back. His name's Dan Roytas. He's been doing some spectacular work. I mean, real paradigm shifting work. He came on before and we talked about the vitamin industry and how that's potentially a scam. And today we're going to be talking about Dan's incredible book, Can You Catch a Cold? Dan, how are you, my friend? Good evening.
I'm doing really well, John. Pleasure to speak with you again. I really enjoyed our last conversation, and I'm looking forward to having another riveting conversation with you again this evening.
Yeah, no, thanks, mate. Thanks for coming on again. Really appreciate it. And so you published this book, what was it, a couple months ago? And I just want to know, could you firstly just flash it up for the audience so we can have a look at it, see it in all its glory?
Yes, I have it here.
There you go.
That's an author copy. So that line across the front just says author copy. So uh, yeah, there's not a big black ugly line across the front of the front cover.
Yeah, yeah. No, I know what it's like because I've published a couple of books recently, like kids book, coloring in books for my niece and nephew. So I know I actually gave them that, but so yeah, so I know the deal with Amazon, yeah, and stuff like that. But anyway, your book, how's it been doing?
Yeah, it's done well. I've
Yeah.
been really happy with the response. Released it in late March 23rd, I think it was.
Mhm.
And yeah, from the moment that I released it, it just started gaining more and more traction. And it's definitely ruffled a few feathers and got a few people questioning things, which is what the book was intended to do. It went very quickly to the top 100 in Amazon Australia. So that was something that I wasn't expecting.
Mm.
And I'm very humbled with that result. And I'm very grateful as well to everyone who supported me and purchased a copy of the book. We managed to break into the top 1,000 of books on Amazon.com as well, which is a pretty big accomplishment. So yeah, it's still doing well. And now it's just a matter of doing the hard work of promoting the book. So
Mm.
writing it was the easy part. No, just kidding.
Mhm.
And now it's just getting out there, talking to people, letting them know that it's available, and informing people about this issue, because I think it's really important, more so than it ever has been, than where we are right now with today's society and all the things that have happened over the last 4 years.
I mean, this is probably, I would say, the most important book you could write in today's times. I mean, with everything that's going on, if we continue down the path we're going on, we're in a bit of trouble. But, if we can sort of turn the ship around a little bit and start moving people back to actually what we're going to talk about is how it used to be. That's the thing people don't understand, that there was a time when this was sort of almost frowned upon, this sort of germ theory, right? But we've taken this different path, and people need to realize that this hasn't always been the status quo. This was actually once the abstraction, wasn't it? But we've known it for so long, for the last sort of hundred and so years, 200 years, that it's almost become completely invincible and unquestioned. You can't really question it anymore, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what the book really set out to do. It's
Mm.
not there to tell people what to think. It's more so getting people to think. I've put the information forward, and people can read it and interpret it the way that they see fit. And it challenges this long-held belief about contagion, that diseases are transmitted between people. Uh, and I mean, we can get into this conversation, but I mean, if we go back to the very sort of beginning of all of this, uh, mid to late 1800s, the medical profession was about to throw out the idea of contagion completely. So they were utterly convinced, the overwhelming majority of doctors in the late 1800s about 90% had disbanded this theory of contagion. They were all in agreement that diseases aren't contagious, and it was about to be thrown out. There was a meeting that was held in one of the medical associations over in New York, and they were calling for the end of germ theory, the end of contagion. A few years later, Louis Pasteur publishes his germ theory, and then everything changes. So the history is not the way that people think. It wasn't like we started with this idea that there was a germ and there was something getting passed around and there was contagion, and then we started adding evidence to it and we built up to get to this idea, and it slowly became accepted more and more as time went on. It was actually the other way. It was, we were about to throw it out, and then it was thrown a lifeline by people like Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch. Lister was another guy that did work in the early days with germ theory. And that was the lifeline that they needed to attach or to rescue themselves from this failing doctrine. And even then, it wasn't accepted. So it took 30 years in places like the United States for it to become commonly accepted. Doctors and the medical profession fought tooth and nail against accepting this because it didn't align with what they were seeing in practice and in their daily lives. So when I say this, what I mean is they didn't observe evidence of contagion. So they would see a sick person in a family of, say, 10, 15 people, because back then the families were quite large. And often there would only be 1 or 2 people sick in the home, and everyone else was fine. So it didn't, what they were witnessing in their personal life and their personal experience and in clinical practice failed to substantiate this idea that diseases are passed between people. So yeah, I've gone back through the history and I've laid it out from basically, the early 1800s and stepped through all the major events that happened so that people can get a really good idea of how we got to this point where we are now in the modern time of accepting this idea that if you cough or sneeze on me, John, I'm going to catch your disease.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, this is just groundbreaking stuff. What would you say then, when they talk about the pandemics, the bubonic plague, the Great Plague of London, the Spanish flu, what were these all being put down to? Not the Spanish flu, because probably that came after the germ theory started to come about again, but the other great plagues around the world. At that time, then, what were they putting that down to if it wasn't the contagion?
Yeah, well, you know how I said that there wasn't this build-up to accepting germ theory where we had
Yeah.
this accumulation of evidence over time. What actually happened was we had a build-up of an accumulation of evidence over time to disprove contagion.
Mm,
So when we're talking about the bubonic plague, and again, I cover this in the book,
mm,
there were people like Napoleon himself, supposedly,
mm,
and his direct reports, who did human-to-human transmission experiments with bubonic plague victims, where they would take the bodily fluids from a person with the plague and inject it into themselves and other people, put people with the plague in rooms and houses with healthy people. And not once did they ever make anybody sick. And they did this to dispel the fear, the soldiers' fear that they were going to catch the bubonic plague from their fellow soldiers and their fellow mates. So they disproved that it was actually contagious. At the time, the sort of consensus was that it was a thing called a miasma, which caused disease, which is bad air. Now, I don't know if it was actually bad air that was the cause, but they said this bad air emanated from places of filth. So unsanitary conditions, people defecating in the street, throwing their human waste out onto the street, people walking through a foot high of human waste, animal waste, dead animals in the street, not getting access to clean drinking water because the water was contaminated with this filth, decaying vegetable matter, dead bodies, dead animals, all this sort of stuff. So they believed that it was actually the emanations from this stuff going into the air that made people sick. But then eventually they realized, no, it's actually poor nutrition, unsanitary conditions, access to drinking water, poor housing conditions, working conditions, all of these kinds of things, which were directly contributing to disease. And essentially, as the germ theory was, the inception of germ theory was sort of, when it was taking hold, essentially, the common consensus was that it was the exposure to common environmental factors, not a virus or a bacteria, that made people sick.
Yeah, wow. Because the way that I look at it, Dan, is that if you had a pond and you had fish in the pond and they all died, you wouldn't immediately think, oh, there must have been one fish that passed it on to another fish, and then that fish passed it on to the other fish. The first thing you check is the water, I would have thought, right? That would be like the first logical point of inquiry there. And you'd check the quality of the water and if there's an issue there, and if that that there's a toxicity within the water. That I would think would be like the first thing you do. But when we extrapolate that out to society and we see people getting ill, especially in the last 4 years, instead of actually thinking about the environment, it's almost that isn't even thought of at all. And it's immediately thought of person to person. It's just how have we got from that way of thinking and completely inverted it and removed it from our thinking? I just find that mind blowing that we don't even consider the environment into any of these things. I mean, do you have a comment on that? Because I just think that for me, surely that's the first thing you look at.
Look, this is my opinion. So take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Around the same time that germ theory was being released was around the same time that plastic was invented and was starting to be widely used in industry. It was around the same time that pesticides and synthetic fertilizers were starting to be used. It was around the same time where we had agricultural revolutions that changed the way that we did farming. So we were no longer farming sustainably and regeneratively from an enclosed system. So everything that you needed on your farm came from the farm. You weren't bringing hundreds of kilograms of synthetic poison from the outside into your farm. So these things were being introduced into the environment. Now, if you go from a civilization that is living in, I guess compared to today, living in relatively good health. I mean, there wasn't the rates of chronic disease that we see now. And certainly in like underdeveloped countries and native tribes, they didn't have any of these diseases that we have today. And there's good evidence to substantiate that. So if you start releasing poison into the environment in the form of plastics and pesticides, people would cotton on to the fact that that was making them sick pretty quick, because last year we weren't using it. This year we are using it. What changed? Oh, shit. We're spraying hundreds of kilograms of pesticide on our food. Oh, we're putting plastic into the environment. People would revolt against that and they wouldn't stand for it. They wouldn't want these things being used. So I think what actually happened was germ theory possibly was invented as a scapegoat to draw the attention away from the true cause, to say, look, it's not the plastic, it's not the poison, it's not the unsanitary living conditions, it's not the processed food, it's not the smog in the air from manufacturing facilities and exhaust from cars, it's not the synthetic clothing that you're wearing, it's not the poison that we're putting in the water supply, it's not the artificial lighting that you're being exposed to. It's not any of these things. It's the germ. So focus on nature. It's nothing that man is doing. It's what nature is doing. And that's the only way that those industries could get away with using these things in a widespread fashion basically on every continent on the earth. So this is why I think we need to look at this in with a critical mind, because if we continue to blame a germ and we continue to blame nature, so it's not just a germ, like people say parasites and mold and viruses, bacteria. Now there's this trendy thing saying that it's like emotional traumas and things, but we don't have to get into that today. But we're always blaming either the human body or we're blaming nature. We're never looking at the true underlying cause. So there's always this scapegoat sort of red herring thing going on, which blinds us to the truth.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that would be, so you would say that that was around the time of the Spanish flu then, would you say? Was that the introduction of the plastics and the pesticides came at a time when we saw a pandemic emerge from that? Is that right?
No, it's probably earlier. So that's probably
Yeah.
closer to the Russian flu, which happened in the
Right.
late 1800s, so around 1890, I think. It was probably
Right. Okay.
closer to when pesticides and plastics and things were
Wow.
being more widely spread, or their spread was more widely spread. Sorry, their use was more widely spread.
Mm-hmm.
The Spanish flu, I mean, that's really interesting. Again, I've just gone into this and looked at all the evidence and I've laid it all out in the book. So I'm not saying one thing or another. I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm saying, look at this. What do you think? Make up your own mind.
Mm.
Now, with the Spanish flu, what I found was that at the same time that this disease called the Spanish flu broke out, which consisted of symptoms like your entire body turning blue,
Mm.
bleeding from the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose, coughing up bloody yellow frothy sputum, smelling like musty hay or straw,
Mm.
waking up in the morning completely healthy, and then going out to work and then dying on the way to work an hour later as you're walking to your place of employment. Like it struck within minutes. You were asphyxiating and dying,
Mm.
and you died where you stood.
Mm-hmm.
So this was what happened with the Spanish flu. Right heart. Sorry, I'm really mixing up my words today.
Right.
Right-sided heart failure was another very common symptom of the flu. Now, it's really interesting that because they're very specific symptoms. I mean, that's a pretty extreme case of influenza. At the same time that the Spanish flu broke out, we had World War One. Now, at the same time, we also started uh, exposing millions, if not billions of people around the world, and particularly on battlefields, to chemical warfare agents like phosgene gas.
Mm.
Now, if you look at the symptoms and signs of phosgene gas poisoning, exactly the same
Mm.
as Spanish flu.
Mm.
Your body turns blue. Heliotrope cyanosis is what they called it. You would bleed from all of your orifices. You would cough up this bloody yellow, frothy sputum. You would smell like musty hay or straw,
Mm.
which, I mean, that's a very, very peculiar symptom. You would have right-sided heart failure. And depending on the amount of exposure that you got, you would die within a matter of minutes to hours. If you got exposed to a small amount, you would be asymptomatic for up to 48 hours. And then the progression of symptoms would be very, very slow. And then it would start to become much more severe within about 72 to 96 hours. Now, the people who were most widely affected by the Spanish flu were young men of fighting age, between 18 and about 40 years of age. So again, very peculiar that a flu would affect men of this very young age who are meant to be healthy and fit. Usually flus are meant to affect very young people, so children and infants, or the very old
Yeah.
people, like elderly 80, 90-year-old people, right? But the Spanish flu didn't do that. So when you think about this demographic of people that were being killed and affected by the Spanish flu, they were the same demographic and age of people who were on the front lines fighting wars. Now, people might also say, well, you know, how do you explain people getting sick in city areas and built up areas, for example, that were very far away from the battlefields on the other side of the planet, on the other side of this realm that we live in? There are documented reports in the literature by the military that said there were enemy spies infiltrating city areas, coming into supermarkets and cinemas and various other built-up places and releasing canisters of flu germs in the street and in these buildings. So were they really releasing flu germs? Or were they releasing canisters of phosgene gas? Now, like phosgene gas is odorless, is tasteless, and it's invisible. You can't see it. You can't smell it. There's nothing to warn you that you've been exposed to this stuff. So it's the perfect weapon. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not saying that this is what happened, but I'm sort of joining the dots here and going, this is very coincidental. And then you also have like surgeons conducting autopsies at this time. And they write, many of them write that they were unable to differentiate on autopsy the damage that was done to people with the Spanish flu and gas poisoning. The symptoms and the signs were identical. So for me, I just look at that and go, what is the likelihood that a virus would come out of nowhere randomly and cause the symptoms exactly the same as a chemical warfare agent that was developed and produced en masse, hundreds of millions of kilograms of this stuff, and then dispersed on human beings? People can make up their own mind about that.
That's wild, Dan. That is like, yeah, that's big. Is that mustard gas? Is that another word for mustard gas or not?
Mustard gas is a different chemical warfare agent.
Right.
Mustard gas became what they use in chemotherapy. So it's
That's another one. That's
just been repurposed essentially.
right.
And again, like you can go and validate this for yourself. There are papers in the medical literature that talk about this openly, right? So
we got
I
to
mean,
this
yeah,
point.
we're being
How
we're
we even
being
got to this
exposed to
point?
poisons.
Yeah. How did they? Okay, so all right, so let's just go with that. Let's just say that they were spraying this everywhere. How were they doing that? How were they spraying it so that it completely blanket covered, the well, I don't know how far it went because it did actually go. I don't know exactly the geography of the Spanish flu, but I know it went quite far, didn't it? But how were they able to, successfully blanket everywhere with that, with the spraying?
Well, there were many areas that weren't affected. And if you actually look at the spread of the Spanish flu, it's inconsistent with human to human contact. So there's actually epidemiological studies that say the way in which it's spread is incompatible with it being passed from person to person. There must have been something else going on because it didn't spread along the lines of human transit. And it crossed vast oceans in a very, very short amount of time. And I mean, back then it took many weeks sometimes to cross oceans this sort of distance, but we would see it appear in multiple locations at the same time, which is sort of, it defies this idea that it starts in a central location and spreads outward. So how did this spread if it was a chemical warfare agent? Well, I sort of mentioned before that the military came out and said that the enemy were coming into the Sorry, my brain is really
And
struggling
mine
today.
too as well. Don't worry. We'll bumble it together. Don't worry, Dan.
So yeah, they were saying that the enemy soldiers and enemy forces were basically infiltrating cities around the world and coming in and releasing
Right.
canisters of flu germs. But because phosgene gas is clear, odorless, colorless, no one would have known that this was being released. So they would have been exposed to it. You have an enemy soldier come into a cinema and he opens up a canister of phosgene
Right.
gas and the people in there get poisoned. So they were admitting that this was happening, that the military admitted this was actually happening. Many newspapers, mainstream newspapers around the world also admitted that this was going on. Because I think back then they were still doing a bit of investigative journalism. And I think that some truth was still being reported.
Mm.
And then you also have eyewitness reports of ships, camouflaged ships, sneaking into ports under the cover of darkness and releasing what they said were greasy looking clouds, which wafted over the city and the port. You also have reports of people finding canisters washing up on the shore. So that what they were suggesting was that there are actually enemy submarines coming in close to the shoreline and basically blanketing the shoreline with phosgene gas in cylinders, which would then obviously waft over the surrounding area. And anyone who was unlucky enough to go for a walk on the beach that day might pick up this canister and take it somewhere else, or it might actually expose them directly at that point in time. And they may die a very short time later. But hey, it was the flu. They caught the virus and they died from that. So we were possibly looking at the wrong thing,
Mm.
and the whole time the true underlying cause was just going unnoticed.
So who was dropping that then? Who was releasing that exactly? Which country? We don't know.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have no idea. So the Americans were saying the enemy was doing this.
Mm.
So you would assume that they're blaming it on Germany.
Outside. Yeah.
Um, Again, I mean, I don't know exactly who this was. I think I can only go off what I've read in these reports, and they never labeled a specific country or a specific person or a specific operation that did this. They just said that we know it's happening. They were obviously finding evidence of this occurring. They were finding canisters and things being left around.
Mm.
Um, and maybe to sort of like quell the fear of the population, um, you would blame this on a virus.
Yeah.
So you have some hope of protecting yourself, right?
Mm.
If I stay away from everybody and I do all these things and I lock myself indoors, maybe I can remain protected. But I think people would be panicking even more so if
Mm.
they knew it was actually a gas attack,
Yeah.
because that's something that you can proactively prevent against. There is a visible enemy that you can actually work against rather than an invisible microscopic enemy that could just pounce at any time.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, I don't suppose you've listened to Tom Cowan's verdict of the Spanish flu. He talks a little bit about the advent of radio waves. There was like an upping of the Earth's electromagnetic frequency. There's a radification, I don't know if that's the right word, of the Earth. And that creates a certain amount of initial, almost like radiation pneumonitis, where people get flu-like symptoms when there's like a spike in the kind of the electromagnetic, I think it's electromagnetic frequency of the Earth. And that can create those flu-like symptoms, which can then be put down to like a spread of a germ. I don't know if you've heard Tom talking about that. I mean, maybe that could be another element to it. Or I know there's someone called Arthur Furstenberg who's written books about that as well. But do you have any sort of comment on that, or would you just say that that could be something worth investigating?
I looked for evidence to support this, and there is suggestions of this,
Yeah.
but I mean, the symptoms are very, very specific.
Mm.
Your entire body turns blue, and like they called it the Black Death. You asphyxiated and the oxygen supply was cut off because your lungs essentially just dissolved into nothing.
Mm.
You asphyxiated to death, and they were saying that a white person,
Mm.
their body turned black. They couldn't differentiate between a white person and a black person if you got the Spanish flu. Your body was that black. You have this smell of musty hay or straw. You have right-sided heart failure. Like the symptoms are so specific, yet all these symptoms in this disease went away almost to the day the war stopped.
Mm,
But electromagnetic frequencies and things remained. So we would expect to see these very specific symptoms continue over a period of time. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, it's documented that phosgene gas exposure causes this, but I've never seen one piece of solid evidence to suggest that exposure to an electromagnetic frequency can kill you within a matter of hours and cause these very specific symptoms. It's possible, but again, as I said, I haven't come across this
yeah.
evidence, and therefore I couldn't put it in the book.
Yeah. And if we roll it forward to 2020, what's your verdict on that? Because I mean, I'm someone of the opinion that there was no pandemic. I know that, that's a bit out there for a lot of people, but I think, there's a small handful of us that are starting to think like this now. I think that they fudged the data so that the flu disappeared. And then they were using those cases to put it into the COVID cases. But I would say though that I didn't wear a mask and I didn't do any tests and I went about my day normally. But I did have for about 3 days, I felt completely burnt through here. It felt like poisoning. It's the only way I can describe it. And I knew it wasn't an organic, it wasn't something organic. It wasn't a normal disease. I felt like I'd been burnt, poisoned. I feel as though they might have been releasing something, toxins. I'm not saying a kind of a natural pathogen. I just mean a kind of a toxin that could have been put in either sprayed water. How else might they have done it? But some kind of proliferation of toxins. But something completely burnt my innards, and I had that for about 3 days. I was on fire. What do you think about COVID then? Do you think that could have been a bit similar to the Spanish flu? Do you think there might have been like an actual, because they had the lab leak story and all stuff like that, but that still kind of kept that idea of germ theory going. It was either bat soup or lab leak, that kind of, and you can't think outside of that, which is quite funny how they did that. But what's your verdict on that? And do you, for me, I don't believe that there was an actual contagion, a person to person contagion, but I think potentially they might have been putting more toxicity in our environment to spike people. Even things like wearing the blue mask. I think there's chemicals in that might have created people talked about not being able to taste or to smell, and they're wearing this bloody blue plastic mask all day. There's just so what's your opinion on all that, Dan?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy there. It's
Mm.
either a lab leak or a
Yeah.
virus. It's like, I don't think it was either of those things.
Yeah.
I think what we witnessed, John, was a pandemic of fear.
Mm.
It was a completely
Oh, yeah.
constructed event. I don't think there was anything. There's nothing new. I don't even think that there was a poison or a chemical or anything released. I think what's happened here is, I mean, because people say, well, what was different?
Mm.
Well, there was a lot that was different. You've alluded to many of those things. We were locked in our houses. We were locked
Mm.
down. There was bombardment of messages of fear on the news and the radio and public health authorities and the government making it out this is going to be the worst thing since the Spanish flu and half the world's going to die and it's going to kill your whole family and you better not go outside because you're going to bring it home and kill people. So there's this whole fear and anxiety element. You're not going outside, you're not getting fresh air, you're locked in your home,
Mm.
you're eating junk food, you're probably over consuming alcohol and doing all these other things that you may not do so much in your day-to-day life. But because now you don't have to go to work for several weeks and you're locked in your home, you're probably ordering Uber Eats and getting all junk food delivered straight to your doorstep. You may be really stressed out about what's going on, so you're not sleeping so well. You're covering your face, so you're not breathing enough oxygen and possibly inhaling all sorts of particulate matter from these masks, as you said. Um, there's this fear of uncertainty about not knowing when this is going to end. How far is this going to go? Are they going to take this all the way? Um, in the area that I lived, it was a built up area. And the major grocery store was empty within like 24 hours. There was nothing left. So imagine walking down there as say, a young mother with a family and going, oh, I better just stock up on some, oh, it's all gone. Like you've never seen that before in your whole life. And now you're like, oh my God, how am I going to feed my kids? So that like there's so many different things that were different that were disruptive to your day-to-day life. So we don't know how people may have responded to that. And then there's also the fact that the flu disappeared. Like there was not a single case of influenza in, I think even in Queensland where I was living at the time. There was none, no flu, gone. Like, how is that possible? They said, oh, it's because people were locking down and socially distancing and blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay. So how did SARS-CoV-2 spread then? Right? So like SARS-CoV-2 wasn't impacted by these social distancing measures and locking down and wearing masks, but influenza was. Like, oh, what a smart virus.
Mm.
We've also got this nocebo effect too, John, which I don't think people give enough credit to. So people were told the symptoms that they were to experience, that you will lose loss of smell and taste, that you will have unusual symptoms or upper respiratory and lower respiratory symptoms. You will get X, Y, Z. We know that by putting messages over the media, like the news and the internet, social media, newspapers, the radio, by telling people that they are going to experience certain symptoms, they will experience those symptoms. And this has been validated in things that have happened in relation to non-contagious illnesses. So in New Zealand, I think in like 2000 and I can't remember now, around 2010 or I can't remember particularly specific dates. There was an antidepressant medication that came off patent and they started rolling out a generic drug. And the media, because in New Zealand, you can still advertise for drugs over there. So they were saying to people, if you're taking this drug, there's a new generic drug out now that you'll be taking, and it's got a whole new raft of side effects. And they only listed about 5 or 6 of these side effects. And they saw a massive spike in people suffering these 5 or 6 side effects that the media told them that they were going to suffer from or to expect. Yet the list of side effects was like 20 things long, but no one reported any of the side effects that they weren't told to experience. So we know that when the media does this, it can induce this nocebo effect and people experience what they're told to experience. So when you have every single media outlet in the world, every single government, every single health body saying the same message on repeat for 3 years straight, right? It's all you hear. It's all your friends and family are talking about. It's like it consumes your entire life.
Yeah.
Is it possible that you then manifest these symptoms? I mean, there's also been human experiments done to show this as well, that the power of belief can manifest influenza. So they have done experiments where they took people, put them in a room for observation, and made them believe that they'd been exposed to flu germs. And within a matter of hours, they were coughing and sneezing and spluttering and all this mucus coming out of every orifice, you know, wailing and moaning in their bed for the whole night. And the next day, the nurses come in and go, sorry, we lied to you. We didn't actually expose you to flu germs. We exposed you to saline. And they were better within the hour. Their symptoms went away. So just the power of belief is enough to create the symptoms. So I think my original point was this was a pandemic of fear. It's a nocebo effect. And all these other things that we did that deviated from our normal way of life were most likely the cause of all these other things that we saw.
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of thinking the same way. It's just I didn't believe any of it. I knew there wasn't a virus like quite early on. I was saying that. I even went to Speaker's Corner, Dan. It's like a very famous part of Hyde Park where, you know,
Yeah.
you've had a lot of people go there in the past, historical figures stand on their soapbox. And I got on mine very early on. And I said to everyone, I was one of the first people to do it. In the first week, you know, I got down there and I said, guys, take off the mask, because the mask is the visual hypnotic command that holds this whole lie together. If we don't wear the mask, then no one will see a pandemic. The mask is there to remind everyone to stay in fear visually. And so I was on my soapbox and I was saying this, and I had people come over to me and shout at me and get into a debate with me. But I was early on, I could just tell it's a discernment. I think you said this before as well. It's like you just know something inside, it just clicks. You know it. You don't have to do too much research. It's off. A little bit like a child has that discernment, you know, because they can just tell a good person or a bad person. Don't have to analyze this person. It's just kind of it's just a knowingness, right? And I think that's how people kind of find the truth, is that there is a certain thing that just comes to you straight away and you just know. And then the other thing, just you can research, but it just reinforces what you already know, right? That's kind of how it was for me. But I would say though, I still did get that burning through here though, and I don't know what the hell that was. But and I was just like, I didn't believe any of it though, Dan. So what do you think might have happened there?
No idea.
No idea.
You know, I got symptoms
Yeah.
that were unusual from any other flu that I'd had
Yeah.
before,
Mm.
but I was better in a few days.
Yeah.
And, you know, if there wasn't a pandemic, would I have thought of anything different? Would I have gone, oh, gee, I've got a
Mm.
different kind of flu this year. It's unusually bad. It's like, if the message wasn't there and it was just going about my normal day in life, I would have gone, oh, that's a bit unusual. Well, I'll be over it in a few days. And I would have thought nothing more.
Mm.
I mean, I'm in the health I'm in the health industry. If there was something out there that was contagious, I would have been the first person to be like, tell my whole family, don't you dare go outside. You stay locked in your house. I will go to the shop, because my
Yeah.
parents are elderly and they're in a
Mm.
risk category. Elderly. They're getting older. They won't like me hearing me say that they're elderly, but they're getting older. Um, and I would have gone to the shops for them. I would have got the groceries. I would have been doing everything I possibly could to prevent my family from getting infected and possibly dying from this disease. And John, I did nothing personally. I didn't get COVID.
Mm.
I did get, in 4 years, a flu which lasted for maybe 3 or 4 days.
Mm.
And it was a little bit more severe than usual, but I mean, I was stressed out of my mind.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, my family got like colds and flus, but it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. But they did the testing and, oh, I got COVID and whatever. Okay.
Mm.
And I guess like another thing that we have to consider here is contagion real? And in the book that I wrote, I went and found 200 experiments. So this is a major part of the book. 200 experiments that were done where doctors and scientists and researchers put sick people in close proximity to healthy people, expose them in every way imaginable. So coughing in each other's faces, spitting in each other's mouths, drinking snot, being injected with blood. I mean, you name it, they did it. And in the overwhelming majority of these experiments, no one ever got sick. The only time they saw people get sick was when they did things to them that were not reflective of the natural mode of transmission. So one experiment took the snot of 40 people, mixed it up together in a container, added some reagents to it, which are known to cause flu-like symptoms, and they went and injected it directly into people's veins. And they got a bit of a cold. They got these cold-like or flu-like symptoms. And they said, see, this is proof of transmission. But this is not the way that we're told that colds and flus spread. So they couldn't demonstrate this phenomena, which should be very, very easy to prove. So we're told from a very early age that when I come in contact with a sick person, they'll cough on me, spread their germs to me, and I'll get sick. Should be really, really easy to do this experiment. You get a bunch of sick people, a bunch of healthy people, and you put them in the same room and you see what happens. They did that. Nothing happened. So then you could take it to the next level. Okay, well, now let's get up into each other's faces and cough and sneeze and splutter. And like they did experiments where they were getting people to get hankies and like cotton gauze and hoik up phlegm from their lungs and blow out snot all over these pieces of gauze and hankies, and then get people to stuff it up their nose. Like they did
Oh,
everything. They did everything. They took bodily fluids from sick people with influenza, injected it into monkeys. And then when the monkey got a fever, they took blood from the monkey and then went and injected it into healthy people's veins, directly into their bloodstream. They didn't get sick. So like
but the monkey did though. That's the thing.
the
No,
monkey got a fever, but it was
right,
injected with many, many milliliters of goop from a person's respiratory tract, which
right,
should never end up
right.
in
Okay,
your
yeah,
bloodstream.
yeah, fair enough.
Possible to
Yeah,
do that, right?
yeah,
Naturally.
okay, yeah, okay, yeah.
And they point to this as like, oh, well, this is proof of transmission.
Mm.
So they can't prove this phenomenon. It should be a very easy to thing to prove. They couldn't prove it. So therefore, you throw out the theory and you start again. You go, right, there's something else going on here. But unfortunately, this idea has been ingrained into us since the day we could walk and talk. And therefore, it's very, very difficult for us to let go of these preconceived ideas because it challenges our entire reality. It's threatening to who we are as a person and all of our beliefs and our perspectives and perceptions of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know with your profession, you were like the golden boy, and you were, you know, regurgitating the dominant paradigm of, what we're meant to believe from school, as you said there. And then you started to question things, started to ask questions, and you'd have thought that would have been welcomed and embraced in a scientific field where that's the whole purpose of science, right? But you were quite unceremoniously sort of kicked out, disenfranchised, weren't you? Ostracized, and you've gone solo now, and you've written this book, and you've actually, it's probably one of the best things that's happened to you, really, because now you're a bit of a maverick, and you're really, you're creating ripples now, and that's affecting other people, and they're now having the confidence to talk about this. So, how's that been for you, Dan? I mean, how's that kind of trajectory been, and from what you've gone through to where you are now?
Yeah, it's been a major change from working as a senior lecturer at a university, teaching nonsense, to actually waking up and realizing that everything I thought I knew was wrong, throwing it all out, having the humility to do that, and then start from the ground up. And like I did get blacklisted. I became the black sheep, went from the golden boy to the black sheep.
Mm.
And one thing I realized is that even though I was teaching in a health science degree, none of the lecturers understand, and probably today, to this very day, don't understand what the scientific method is. They have no idea about what it is. And that's a problem because that's how you prove cause and effect, a cause and effect relationship. So they're out there like throwing all these claims around like X causes Y. And I turn around and go, hang on a second. Let's evaluate this claim based on its scientific merits.
Mm.
And you go to the paper and you read it and you go, they never proved that. They never proved what they concluded in the end part of the paper. They didn't conduct an experiment that demonstrates cause and effect. So therefore, we can't make this claim. And they didn't like that. They didn't like that because it
Mm.
challenges everything, not just viruses, but like vitamins and things as well. Even like the causes of disease, like when we start getting into like chronic illness,
Mm.
so much that I think we've been led astray by. And it causes a lot of confusion. People are like, oh my God, disease is really complicated. And what do I do? And oh, sheesh, this is such a hard thing to get right. When in fact, it's really simple. It's just that our thinking is wrong and our understanding about what science is wrong. So we've been led down the garden path. And now what we've got to do is throw all that out. First, evaluate the evidence as it stands and find out what can we say that is proven, what hasn't been proven,
Mm.
throw out the rubbish, and let's start again from the ground up. And when you do that, you come to a realization that you can only prove so much in nature. You can't, it's very difficult to do science on a human body, on the internal functions of a human body, or the inside of a fruit, or the inside of a vegetable, or anything like this. It's very difficult to do science on that. So what you find is that we start doing pseudoscience. People make up stories to explain what they think is going on. They glam it up with the pseudoscience, and they prop it up and make it look like it's really good stuff and it's based in sound scientific knowledge and experimentation. But in fact, it's not. So we hold on to these false ideas and we run with them for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And then no one's willing to let them go because they're the sacred cow, and entire industries are built off this stuff. So not many people want to come out and question this and challenge it because it means that they essentially lose their livelihood, which I did. But I'm here for the truth. I want to know what the truth is. And I don't think we need to be confused and in the dark about how to achieve and maintain good health. I think it's relatively simple. But when it is turned into a big industry and it is made complicated, then people have to outsource their health. They become reliant on other people to manage their ill health. They can never actually truly heal. And we become disempowered. We lose control over ourselves. And we are that way forevermore. Whereas the opposite approach is we can take control back. We can become empowered. We can do some make some very minor adjustments and course corrections and see wonderful healing effects from that. So yeah, it's time to make a course correction. The people that want to know this information can align themselves with it. And there are many people who are not ready. And that's okay. They're on their own journey and they'll get there when they do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Thomas Kuhn's work of Structure of Scientific Revolution, I might have got that wrong, but talking about paradigm shifts anyway, it's a book from 1962. You know, the dominant paradigm, there's anomalies that are formed, and then there seems to be a bit of a kind of a disillusionment with what's going on. Those anomalies can't be answered. And then it comes to a point where there's a bit of a tipping point and new ideas come in, and then there's a complete paradigm shift. But it takes those questioning those axioms, those fundamentals that at the moment preclude any examination. It's those axioms that start to be questioned again at the very root, at the very nucleus, and then there's like a mass sort of what do you call it, a tipping point where it then flips into the new paradigm. But it takes the bravery to really go back and look at those things that we've taken for granted, as you mentioned there. You know, is this where they said, oh, you talked about how they just immediately just consider that the done way, and you're going, hang on a minute, let's just actually investigate that thing that you've just accepted as the norm. They don't like that, but that's part of the way that we actually move forward and we actually create these new shifts. And so I'm glad that this is all sort of starting to happen now. And before we sort of finish up, can I just get you to hold up the book again, Dan? Your book.
Sure.
Give that another plug here. So guys, if you can, I want you to buy this book, support everyone here. It's called Can You Catch a Cold by Dan Roytas. And, come on, I'm bringing on these incredible thought leaders like Dan. And, I know what it's like to write a book. It takes years to write these sorts of things and the amount of research that goes into it. And so please support Dan. How's that been writing down? I mean, that obviously, I know from hearing some of your other interviews, I mean, it's more than just going onto Google, isn't it, to put the research into something like this?
Yeah, it's years of work, John. That's 4 years of work, 60 hours a week in, week out, many, many, many late nights, over close to 1,500 references in there. A team of people helping me. Dr. Sam Bailey, amazing woman, wrote the foreword and also helped act as an advisor, as did her husband, Mark Bailey, who helped me edit the book. Amazing power couple. I'm indebted to them greatly for the work that they did and the assistance that they provided. I had a PhD psychologist look at this for me and help me make major revisions throughout the book, because a lot of it has to do with psychology and the way that we think and looking at things like fear and mass psychogenic illness. I had a microbiologist and virologist come through and edit the book for me. I've had a number of other medical doctors look at this and provide their feedback. So, I mean, so much went into it. And I think we threw out about 50,000 words. I think it was close to 150,000 words at the end. And I said, no, it's too much. So there's probably like another whole book of information there. But you just have to be a bit ruthless sometimes and cut things out. So I tried my hardest to dot my I's and cross my T's. I hope that this information is beneficial to helping people understand what might be going on and to provide an alternative way at looking at things like the cold and flu. But again, don't believe anything that I say. Don't believe anything in the book. All the references and things are there so you can go and check it for yourself. And then you can make up your own mind. And if you're happy with the decision that you make and the conclusions that you come to, and you can live your life happily and healthily with those beliefs, then more power to you. I think it'd be a pretty bland world if everyone thought the same way that Daniel Roytas does. So, yeah, read widely, get access to as much information as you can, and then come to your own conclusions.
Absolutely, that's got to be the advice. Yeah, that's fantastic. Maybe you can do a "Can You Catch the Flu" as like a sequel or something. I don't know. Like a Mr. Man series. You could have like each one's their own little character. But no, it's really good stuff, Dan. And yeah, Sam Bailey, and Mark Bailey, I want to give them a shout out as well. Absolutely beautiful people, really switched on, really loving, kind of caring, and they just want to do good for the world. And you're the same. And it's really nice that you're in contact with them, and you're both, well, all three of you are trying to do some really great work to not even force your opinions onto others, just to encourage, just gently invite people just to, change the way they view things, and just investigate things, and to insource everything again rather than outsource all our, inquiry. That's got to be the way that we do everything these days, I think, is that we've given our power away to others to kind of make decisions for us and think for us. We've got to insource it. We've got to bring it back, and we've got to start looking at things again, reset back to factory settings. That's kind of how I see it. But anyway, Dan, thank you for this episode. Can You Catch a Cold? Please go out and buy this, support Dan, and let's start this kind of new revolution. Well, we're going to go back to how it should have been and how it was at one point, before Pasta's kind of dogma came in. So we can do this, guys. This is an important thing, and society is is ready for this. So thanks, Dan, and yeah, we'll leave it there. Cheers, mate.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate it.